the haunting footage security tried to bury. I first heard about the tape at a truck stop off exit 17, the kind of place where the coffee tastes like burnt pennies and the ceiling tiles always look a little damp. A night shift guard sat 2 stools down from me, staring into a chipped mug, talking to nobody in particular. He kept saying the same line over and over, almost like he was trying to convince himself it wasn't real. You don't hear breathing on a silent feed. You just don't. He said it again, louder, then glanced at me like he knew I was listening and wanted me to ask, so I did. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from? And what time is it there? He told me about Ridgeway Commons, a tired mall just outside a Midwestern town that has more storage units than stoplights. At noon, the place still gets a trickle of shoppers picking through discount racks. After dark, it's a maze of echoing corridors, motionless escalators, and posters for stores that closed long ago. The guard's name was Quinn, and he said there was one hallway on the second level that nobody liked to watch. It ran past a shuttered arcade, past an empty seasonal shop that used to sell calendars and then Halloween masks, and then sat vacant all year. The camera that covered it was labeled C24 on the matrix. Everybody knew C24. Quinn said the first time he saw it was just after 3 in the morning, a Tuesday sliding into Wednesday. He had the control room to himself. Screens stacked from waist to ceiling cast the room in pale gray-blue light. On the metal desk sat a half-eaten donut and a legal pad with the round schedule. The radio was turned down low. The vents hummed with that dry, recycled air that only old buildings breathe. He was checking the feeds in a lazy rhythm when C24 flickered and rolled. Static crawled up from the bottom like heat shimmer. He leaned forward. The hallway was empty. Dust motes drifted. A maintenance door at the far end was chained from the inside. He watched for a full minute, then looked away to note the timestamp. When he looked back, someone was standing under the weak yellow light. No, he told me. Not someone, not exactly. It was as if a body had been assembled out of suggestions, the way a face appears in fog on a bathroom mirror, not there and yet undeniable. It had the length of a person, the outline of limbs, a head tilted as if listening, the posture was wrong, joints too loose, like a figure from a marionette theater with half its strings cut. Bare feet touched the tiles. Arms hung too low. It did not sway. It looked held there by a decision. Quinn reached for the phone. The screen rippled, then sharpened as if focusing. The figure turned its head toward the camera, and the entire feed popped. The room went dark. For 1 second, the monitors threw back his reflection and a ragged shape behind him in the glass. He spun in his chair. The room was empty. The radio hissed once and fell dead. When the power steadied, the other cameras returned. C24 stayed black for a long breath, then snapped back to the hallway. Empty. The maintenance door at the end was still chained. The temperature in the control room felt 10 degrees colder. Quinn told me he listened and heard nothing, but he felt sound, if that makes any sense. The way you feel a big truck pass outside and the floor answers, a low pressure in your chest. He told me he felt breathing. Not his, not the building. Something measured and patient, timed not to be heard. He swore to me he felt it. The guard did what he was supposed to do. He marked the time, rewound the tape, logged the event. He called his supervisor, a broad-shouldered man who'd worked there long enough to know where the cracks were and what to stuff into them. The supervisor came in looking like he hadn't slept. He watched Quinn cue the moment. They sat shoulder to shoulder, eyes inches from the screen. The hallway, the dust, and then, under the weak fluorescent, that shape as it resolved, like frost knitting on a window pane, the supervisor's breath changed. When the head turned and the feed blew out, the man stood so fast his chair toppled. He righted it with shaking hands. "Stop the tape," he said. "Eject it." Quinn laughed, thinking it was a joke. It wasn't. The man's voice went flat, like someone talking to a ledge. "Eject the tape. Put it in the black case. Don't label it, don't log it, I will take it." Quinn hesitated. He said it was an incident. He said cameras had to be kept. The supervisor leaned close enough for Quinn to smell the coffee on his breath and the metallic bite of fear under it. "This is not an incident. You understand? This is nothing. Put it in the case." So Quinn made a copy on a cheap blank, the kind they bought by the hundred. He slid the original into the unmarked black clamshell that the supervisor brought in from his own locker. He handed the copy to his tote bag like it was nothing more than an old training video. The supervisor took the black case and left by the service corridor. It took him less than 5 minutes to disappear with it. Neither of them signed anything. I didn't believe any of it, not really, until I went there. I wanted to see the hallways for myself. Ridgeway Commons sits low and long next to a 4-lane that runs straight as string through farmland, past warehouses and culverts, and a cut-rate motel with a giant plastic cowboy out front. The mall looks like every other older mall in America. Blank walls, faded logos, a patchwork of roof work. But when I walked in near closing, I felt that empty space inside it, the way sound seems to get swallowed. The air smelled like concessions and cardboard. The guard at the podium had kind eyes and a sore knee. He pointed me toward the second level. "You're late," he said, like a joke nobody laughs at. "Shops are closing." I passed a nail salon, a cell phone kiosk, a store selling polished stones and tiny fountains. The escalator whined. On the landing, I could see C-24's stretch of corridor beyond a bend. It looked ordinary. That's what shook me. Nothing special at all. Just cheap tiles, a dead arcade with a sun-faded dragon on the gate, a closed seasonal store with a plastic skull leaned crooked in the display. The air was a touch colder. Maybe the vent was blowing there. Maybe that's all it was. I asked to speak with maintenance. A man with oil-stained hands met me under a rumbling air handler in the bowels of the place. He didn't want to give his name. He said late at night things clicked that shouldn't click. He said doors that had been double-checked came up unlatched. "Sometimes you hear it," he said, eyes not quite on me. "Like someone walking just behind you, not close enough to touch you, close enough to make you speed up." He laughed, short and mean at himself. "I don't go past the arcade after midnight," he said. "It's a shortcut, but I don't take it." I looked for janitorial. An older woman was stripping wax from a stretch of floor near the food court with a humming machine that left everything slick and new for a second before footprints found it again. Her name tag said Pike. She told me about the old cinema that used to occupy the wing behind the arcade. They walled it off when leases changed. "There's a service door back there nobody uses," she said, cutting her eyes to the side. "Chained. Management says it's for insurance. But I've seen the chain move. If I look right at it, it's still. If I look away, it looks different when I look back." I asked about the tape. She flinched. She went quiet long enough that the machine's hum felt too loud. "Some things get put away," she said. "You're not from here. You don't understand what people choose to live with." I found Quinn 2 days later at a diner that opened before dawn for truckers heading east. He looked exhausted, and not in the romantic way. He told me he hadn't slept through the night since the tape. He kept waking at 3. 7. The timestamp etched into his brain like a burn. "Sometimes the clock jumps straight to it," he said, rubbing both eyes with one hand. "I'll swear I went to bed at midnight. I'll roll over once. The red numbers are 3, 7. He admitted he still had the copy. He had hidden it behind a ripped piece of insulation above the breaker panel in his rental because he didn't trust a drawer or a safe or a box. He didn't trust anything that looked like it was meant to keep something. He told me he tried to be rid of it once. He drove it to the river and threw it in. He watched it break the surface and vanish. He slept that night and dreamed in black and gray, an empty hallway, a maintenance door at the end, chained from the inside. In the morning, the tape lay on his kitchen table, damp around the edges, no puddle, no trail, just there like it had always been. I asked if I could watch. He said no so fast, it felt like a reflex. He apologized. He said he had shown it once to a friend and had to leave his own apartment because the sound of the breathing, which shouldn't exist on a silent recording, had found places in the walls to hide. He said his friend moved out of state and never told him where. He said he would never play it again. Then he stared at the sugar dispenser for a long time and nodded at me like a decision was happening to him, not by him. "You can watch it," he said, "but not with me. Not in my place. I won't be there when it's on." We used a cheap VCR from a thrift store because he wouldn't use the one in his living room. We set it up in a storage unit he rented behind a self-serve car wash. Concrete floor. One bulb. He handed me the tape in a grocery bag and stepped outside the roll-up door to smoke. I fed the tape. The blue screen snapped to life. The timestamp glowed in the corner. The crawl of the camera system's overlay looked years out of date, green block letters. But this wasn't years ago. It was just a building that hadn't kept up. The hallway appeared, that bland stretch of tile and burn-spotted ceiling panels. I felt silly, then uneasy, then hollowed out by how ordinary it all was. Far away, a cleaning cart squeaked and fell silent. The hum in the bulb above me settled into a steady tone. I told myself I wouldn't blink. At 3, 7, 13, a ripple moved across the floor that wasn't the camera and wasn't the air. It was the kind of movement you notice only because everything else is still. At 3:7:26, the light 3 panels from the maintenance door flickered once. A shape stood in the next frame that hadn't been in the frame before. It wasn't there, then it was. The shape did nothing. It was the careful silence in a room when someone is trying not to be seen. It was a presence fitted around a human outline and not touching. I realized my own breathing had gone shallow. The shape leaned like it was listening or like it was being listened to by something down the hall. I waited for it to turn. Instead, the maintenance door at the end twitched against the chain as if something behind it had exhaled. The chain stilled, then lifted a fraction of an inch as though weight had lessened on the other side. The shape raised its head. I didn't hear the breathing in my ears. I felt it through my wrist bones, where my pulse lives. The sound, if you can call it that, moved with the tape. When the figure turned toward the camera, the feed flashed white, then dropped to black, then came back with the hallway empty. The timestamp had jumped. The tape had not. When the screen steadied, the spot under the light where the figure had stood showed nothing at all, not even dust, as if a piece of the video itself had been erased by a thumb. The humming bulb in the storage unit clicked twice and settled. I reached for the eject button, like maybe what was on the screen had its fingers on the same plastic, pressing back. My own breath didn't sound like my own. I hit stop. The sound in the room went wrong. Not louder, closer. It sat right behind the center of my sternum and pushed in time with nothing I recognized. Sweat pricked in the middle of my back in a perfect triangle I could trace with 2 fingers. The bulb didn't swing, there was no draft, and yet the air moved against my cheek. I told myself to eject, return the tape, say thank you, leave. The VCR clicked and refused to give the cassette. I pressed again. Nothing. On the screen, the blue returned, then the green block text, then a frame from nowhere, not from the hallway, from the camera room. The angle was wrong for any installed camera. The room and the frame had the same desk, the same matrix of monitors. In the reflection on the largest monitor, I saw a figure in a chair and something behind him that looked like a room, forgetting it had corners. The figure in the chair was me. I yanked the cord from the wall, the screen went dark, the VCR swallowed the tape like a trick. Outside at the curb, Quinn flicked a cigarette into a puddle and didn't ask how it went. He looked at my face, then at my hands, then at the back of the storage unit like he could see through metal. "Keep it," he said before I asked. "I can't have it. If it wants to move, it will. Maybe if you take it far enough, it will stop." I didn't want it, but I took it. Because that's what the story demanded, and because a terrible part of me wanted to watch it again, alone, in a place where I could measure the distance between the breathing I felt and the breathing I could hear. I took it to a motel near the highway, 2 doors down from a soda machine with a flickering light. I slid the tape under the mattress and sat looking at the door until my eyes burned. At 3:07, I woke up sitting straight up in the dark with my hands braced like I'd stopped myself from falling. I hadn't moved. The clock changed to 3:08 without a sound. The next day, I called the county, then the township, then the mall's corporate office. Nobody admitted anything. I filed a request for any incident logs or inspection reports related to Ridgeway Commons security systems. A polite person called me back to say those records were not readily available. Another called to say there had been a clerical error. When I pushed, the line went quiet in a way that suggested someone in a windowless room had covered the mouthpiece and was deciding whether to hang up. So I did the lazy thing and asked people who don't get paid to lie. A patrol officer who had answered an alarm there told me there were cold spots in that building that made the hair on his arms stand up under his uniform. A delivery driver who used the service entrance in the back said he always knocked on the rolling metal door before he opened it, and he listened for a knockback, not because anyone was there, but because it felt rude to enter without notice. A barista from the little coffee place near the north entrance said that most mornings before sunrise, before opening, she saw footprints on the tile that came from nowhere and went nowhere, faint and bare, like someone had been standing a long time in one place, then lifted their feet without walking. 3 weeks into this, I went back. The podium guard had a new knee brace and a new habit of not making eye contact. The lights felt brighter, like management had decided to turn the dimmer all the way up in the hope that the brightness itself would push everything bad into the corners. On the second level, the hallway of C24 looked newly waxed. A laminated sign hung on a stanchion in the middle of the corridor. Restricted. Maintenance only. The chain on the maintenance door had been doubled. Fresh paint covered the scuffs around the latch. Even the plastic skull in the seasonal shop had been turned to face the other way. That night, the alarms triggered twice with no cause. Officers arrived, took a quick loop, and left with their lights off. Later, a worker in housekeeping quit on the spot after mopping the second floor and pausing to wring out the strings. In the reflection on the wet floor, she saw someone stand up under the light and lean toward her. She looked up, no one was there. She looked down, shoes in the water pointed at her. She ran and didn't come back for her last paycheck. Management put out a memo asking employees not to discuss rumors. They instituted a no recording policy on overnight shifts. They replaced 3 cameras and left C24 alone, which tells you everything you need to know about courage dressed up as budget constraints. People stopped taking the shortcut and started adding 5 minutes to every round. The arcade gate collected a new layer of fine black dust that looked like soot. I kept the tape in a fireproof bag inside a locked box inside the trunk of my car. I didn't watch it again for a while. I told myself I was being careful, but I was really being delayed. I dreamed in gray hallways and came awake with my heart hammering in a way that didn't feel like fear, not exactly. It felt like I was trying to match something else's rhythm and failing. On a Sunday afternoon, when the sky looked like a bruise, I drove out to a public library 2 towns over with an AV room and a VCR they loaned for old instructional films. I told the man at the desk I was writing about obsolete media. He gave me a key and told me to be careful with the tracking knob. The room smelled like chalk. I closed the door. I set the tape. I told myself I would watch with the sound all the way down, even though there shouldn't be sound at all. The hallway, again, always the hallway, not quite centered, as if the camera wanted to see something it wasn't allowed to. The light flickered once. The timestamp ticked. My breath shortened in anticipation of something I could not name, the way you hold your breath when crossing a short, dark space between buildings. At 3:07, the space changed. It didn't fill. It changed, the way the air changes just before thunder. The figure stood, not arriving, not approaching, but completing a sentence that had been begun before the camera was pointed there. The figure leaned. The chain on the door ticked against metal like a coin nudged by a fingertip on a table. The figure turned toward the lens. The screen flashed. And then, for a fraction of a second before the feed cut to black, there was a frame I hadn't seen in the storage unit. The same hall, same angle, but the far wall was covered in posters for movies that never came out, titles I didn't recognize, actors whose faces were smudges, as if the tape had decided to remember the theater the way someone else remembered it, wrong and stubborn. The frame popped out of existence. The screen went blue. The VCR purred. I took the tape out and realized the room felt crowded, not with people, with attention. like the air had turned its head. My hands shook as I slid the cassette into its sleeve. In the quiet, I heard the softest sound, a long, careful inhale, like someone trying to make as little noise as possible, practically gentle, and then the long control of the exhale. I held my own breath without meaning to. When I finally breathed, my chest hurt under the weight of it. I left it with a friend in another city who has a habit of collecting things that don't want to be owned. He put it in a mudroom cabinet behind a box of light bulbs. He texted me a week later to say his dog wouldn't walk past that door at night. He called me at 3:11 one morning to ask if old videotape could hold a smell. Like an attic after rain, he said. Like metal, but not sharp. More like the taste of a penny when you put it on your tongue. I told him to get rid of it any way he could. He burned the sleeve, then stared into the flames in his backyard until all the ash turned into a single clumped puck. The tape wasn't in the sleeve anymore. It was in his freezer. He did not put it there. Corporate finally did what corporate always does. They announced a plan to revitalize the property, reduce hours, reimagine underutilized spaces. This meant bricking off the wing behind the arcade and knocking down the service corridor to the old cinema. For 3 days, demolition vans circled the property without going in. The fourth day, a crane rolled into the loading bay with a crew that worked faster than made sense. No photos appeared on social media. No one bragged about the payday. In the morning, the chain was gone from the maintenance store. In its place was a welded plate with 8 bolts and 2 coats of paint. Quinn called to tell me he was done. He had put in for reassignment someplace with loading docks and floodlights and actual people after midnight. He said the night before he walked his last round, he paused at the top of the second floor stairs and listened. He heard footsteps that matched his exactly half a flight behind. He stopped. They stopped. He started. They started. He turned to catch whoever was making a joke. No one. He looked down and saw a dark, perfect oval in the dust at the landing where someone had been standing long enough to warm the floor, except it wasn't warm. It was cold. Colder than the air, colder than the railing against his palm. He never went back. And that should be the end. You want it to be. A building grows tired and mean. People write off the dark. A tape gets lost or buried or both. The world moves on. But sometimes the story doesn't care what the world wants. Because copies get made. You know that. If one exists, more exist. That is how the hungry parts of a thing keep coming back. Every few months, someone uploads a low-resolution clip to a forum that specializes in catching what shouldn't have been caught. The clip is always short. The angle is always the same. The figure always turns its head toward the camera, and those who watch insist they hear a breath that the file can't possibly contain. The clip is always removed within hours, sometimes minutes, not by moderators, not by takedowns. It just stops being there. The thumbnail remains like a tooth. You click and find nothing. I saved one. I shouldn't have been able to, but I did. I watched it once on a laptop that I don't use anymore, in a room I don't sleep in anymore. The figure stood where the light is weakest and leaned as if the building itself was whispering into whatever passes for its ear. The turn toward the camera was worse the second time and worse again the third, because by then I knew what part of the frame would resolve first. Not the shoulders, not the head. The space just in front of the lens, as if something had placed its hand against the glass on the inside. I shut the laptop and took a breath and didn't recognize the sound that came out of me. It was too careful, too measured, too patient. I sat for a long time without moving. Long enough that the street outside went from blue to black, and a siren far off moaned itself small. When I opened the laptop again, the file was gone. The folder was empty. The machine's clock said 3:07. I hadn't changed it. I hadn't touched anything. Here is the part I didn't plan to tell. I'm telling it because you asked for every detail, and because when you ask for every detail, you take some responsibility for what you carry away. The last time I stood in Ridgeway Commons, I waited until the gates closed and the old keypad clicked to arm the system. I waited until the night noise settled into its low, hollow hush. I walked up the silent escalator and stood at the mouth of the hallway covered by C-24. The wax on the tiles had been buffed to a shine. The air felt stiller than air should feel. I called out, not words, just sound. The way you might speak to a stray animal to let it know you are there without scaring it. I didn't hear an answer. I felt one. I felt a tension gather the way frost gathers along the bottom of a window. I took one step forward. The light 2 panels down blinked as if a tired filament had to decide whether to continue. The maintenance door, now a blank of welded plate, answered with a tiny tick like metal settling. My chest tightened. Not pain, weight. I thought, don't turn your head. If you turn your head, you'll give it a reason. I did not turn. I looked straight into the dim and talked in a voice that sounded steady outside my mouth and ridiculous in my own ears. You're noticed, I said. That's all this is. That's all this footage ever was. People noticing you. You don't have to come closer. The pressure in the room changed. A draft that didn't exist moved past my left ear. I could have sworn I heard a breath leave that did not belong to me. I walked backward until my shoulders hit the railing. I kept my eyes on the place under the weak light. I took the stairs down without looking away until the bend hid the corridor. Only then did I blink. Only then did I realize I'd been holding my breath long enough to make stars pop at the edges of my vision. I let the air in. It tasted like coin, like dust, like whatever's left in a room right after the person you've been waiting for has stepped away. Security will tell you nothing happened there. Corporate will tell you the camera malfunctioned. Maintenance will shrug and say old buildings complain at night. The tape will not introduce itself to you unless it decides to. I still wake sometimes at 3, 7, and listen hard, and the house listens back. And on the mornings when the mirror fogs and a shape stands just over my shoulder that shouldn't, I wipe the glass in a single hard stroke from top to bottom without looking at my eyes. I don't give it the satisfaction. If you ever find yourself in a mall like Ridgeway Commons, after closing, walking a long, unbroken hallway toward a door that used to lead somewhere and now goes nowhere, and the air in front of you feels just a touch cooler than the air behind you, and the light above you hums like a mouth just before it speaks, keep your pace steady. Don't turn. Don't say a name. Don't pretend the silence is empty. It isn't. It never was. And if by some chance you hear, not with your ears, but with the part of you that knows when someone is on the other side of a closed door with their hand against it, a breath that is waiting for yours to line up with it, do not try to make yours match. Breathe wrong on purpose. Break the rhythm. Walk away as if you are late for something. Because if you keep the beat for too long, if you share that pattern even for a minute, you may find that when you press play on an old tape in a room that smells like dust and rain, the figure under the weak light does not need to turn toward the camera to find you. It will already be standing exactly where you are, at the precise distance your breath carries in the dark, waiting for you to notice that it has learned your timing and you have learned its. The basement that should have stayed locked. The house at the corner of Maple Street had a way of shrinking the world around it. The sycamores leaned close over the roof. The sidewalk dipped as if the ground itself did not want to pass in front of the porch. Even in summer, when the rest of town hummed with lawnmowers and late baseball games and the soft pulse of cicadas, that address seemed to breathe in a different rhythm. People crossed the street without thinking. Eyes forward, steps quick. They said it was a shame about the Kellers. They said it was better not to dwell on things that would not come back. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it there? Thomas moved to town at the start of a thick, humid stretch, the kind of air that left fingerprints on glass. He rented a basement apartment behind the old laundromat on Birch Avenue and took a night job stocking at the big box store by the highway. It suited him to work while the town slept. Less traffic, fewer faces to read. He told himself he liked the quiet of empty aisles and the steady logic of boxes that needed to be where they belonged. On a Tuesday after midnight, he cut down Maple on the walk home, backpack slung on one shoulder, shoes whispering against the cracked pavement. There was nothing unusual about the night at first. A single porch light, 3 houses away. A distant train horn sliding through the humid dark. He would remember with certainty the exact moment his feet stopped. It was 12:4 1 He checked his phone because the time felt like a pin fastening a page to the wall. In the dirt strip beneath the Keller house windows, a thin rectangle of glass at ground level exhaled a second of light from below. Not a passing car, not a reflection. It pulsed once, pale and cold, and died. He kept walking for 6 steps, told himself it was an appliance dying, a battery coughing its last breath. He turned at the end of the block and came back. The light flashed again from the cellar window, a longer glow, a little brighter, as if something below ground struck a match and held it close to stone. He listened then. The night seemed to hold its breath with him. 3 heartbeats, then a knock from beneath the earth. 1 knock, a pause, a second. The sound traveled through the dirt and into his legs. He told himself a raccoon had gotten into the crawl space. He told himself the stories were small-town shadows stretching for attention. He stepped off the sidewalk into the brittle grass. The front steps creaked under him. The rusting handle turned with a tired sigh. Inside, the smell hit him. Wet paper, cold iron, a memory of bleach that had never reached the places that mattered. The hallway pressed in. Wallpaper peeled like old bandages. A fan of dust trembled in his phone light. He moved past a living room that still held a couch in a shape that remembered backs and elbows. He moved past a dining room where the table wore a skin of gray and the chandelier hung 1 bulb short like a missing tooth. He found the basement door at the end, a door different from the others. Heavy planks, newer than the rest of the wood. A thick chain threaded through iron eye plates. A busted padlock with teeth marks of rust. He put his ear to the seam. The cold rolled out through the slit and slid over his face. The knock came again, close to where his ear pressed. He flinched. The chain rattled. He pulled the door an inch, and the basement pulled back with a breath he could feel but not hear. The stairs were narrow and damp. Stone walls waited below, black where water wept. He took each step with the flat of his foot, testing for rot. The beam of his phone shivered. It brushed old jam jars on a shelf seeded with white dust. It found a workbench, a coil of rope, a saw with a smile of missing teeth. It found the walls, symbols carved into stone, not careful or pretty, hard and fast, deep where the chisel slipped, circles with tails, lines joined in knots. Rough figures standing in groups of 3. Some of the marks were dark with something that had dried and once had weight to it. He said his own name inside his head as a way of not saying the word leave. He swept the light in a slow arc, and there on a table, warped by damp, lay a leather-bound book the color of old coffee. He touched it. The cover stuck and then let go. The first pages were full of the same figures he saw on the walls. Then writing began, English that tilted up to the right. He read a line and did not understand. He read the next and did. Keep it locked. Do not open. Keep it locked and it will not leave the hole. Keep it locked and it will not know your name. The scratching started above him, a long rag of sound drawn slow over wood. He pointed the light up the stairs. The door at the top trembled as if a draft breathed through the house. The scratching crossed the door. It became a pushing. The chain groaned. He grabbed the book and backed toward the far wall, where 2 cinder blocks looked new against the age of the stone. He saw then a patch the size of a window that had been bricked over with unusual care. Mortar smoother than the rest. No gaps, no cracks. He felt a small wind where no wind should be, and the phone light flicked once. He held the book like a shield and moved. He reached the stairs by feeling with his shins. The chain lifted and rattled as if hands unseen were testing it from the other side. He shoved the door with his shoulder and swung the chain back into place. He pressed his palm flat to the wood. It pressed back with a softness like the throat of a sleeping animal. He did not run out of the house. He walked because running would have turned the hallway long as a tunnel and the porch a mile away. Outside, on the sidewalk, he swallowed the warm night like medicine. He held the book under his arm and did not look back until he reached the corner. When he did look, the basement window was dark again. He told himself out loud that he would return the book the next day. He told himself he did not believe anything the book needed him to believe. He lived with the book on his small kitchen table because placing it anywhere else made the apartment lean. He made coffee and put the book beside the mug. He slept in the early morning and dreamed of wooden stairs under a lake at 3:17 p.m. As he folded a shirt, he heard a thud in the floor, soft like a hand laid flat against a door from the other side. He froze. He told himself a truck outside had bounced over a pothole and the sound had traveled through the concrete. He waited. 10 seconds. Then another soft thud from under the kitchen linoleum. He stepped backward and regretted that his apartment was below ground level. He stepped backward again, and his heel touched the carpet runner that led to his own basement door. He stood at the top of his stairs for a long time with his palm on the knob and the book under his arm. The thud did not come again. He told himself he had imagined it. He told himself that the sound under his feet belonged to pipes and old buildings and air. That night at work, he stacked boxes of toothpaste and bleach and dog food, and the aisles felt longer. At 2:08 a.m., his supervisor asked if he was all right. He said he was fine and realized the words had the weight of someone trying to remember whether they had turned off the stove. By Friday, he had read enough of the journal to understand the shape of the story without the dates he chose not to see. The Kellers had bought the house and learned immediately not to spend time in the basement. The writing made small circles around details and then slid off. They heard things. They saw light where there should not be light. They slept with the windows locked, even in heat. The handwriting changed halfway through the book. The second hand pressed harder, the loops taller, as if the letters needed to take up more room to be louder than the sound from beneath. Keep it locked. Do not put your ear to the door. Do not say your name at the top of the stairs. If you step down with a partner. Do not argue on the stairs. The last page before the leather cracked into the binding had a list. Fix the hinge on the chain plate. Replace the lock when the moon is full. Fill the gap under the door with salt and sugar. When it whispers the names of your dead, do not answer. When it says it is cold, do not answer. When it says it will be quiet if you let it breathe, do not answer. On Saturday morning at 10:27, the metal chair at his kitchen table trembled as if a truck passed outside. The walls did not shake, the glass in the cabinet did not clink, only the chair. He lifted the seat and found 3 grains of coarse salt lined up as if someone had placed them there on purpose. He thought of a prank he could not explain. He swept the grains into his palm and threw them into the sink. That night at 3:03, the radio in his bedroom turned on by itself and hissed a long breath of static. The sound rose and fell. Not a station, not a pattern that made sense. It felt like listening to someone breathe through their teeth on the other side of a heavy curtain. He went to the library because daylight often reduces the size of things in the mind. The local history corner, tucked by the genealogy shelves, held a rolled map of the town from before the highway. A librarian with a name badge that said Mara showed him the index cards for property deeds. He found Keller in pencil and someone else before them, and a gap after. He found a smaller box of clippings that smelled of old basement and lemon cleaner. One article mentioned a boy lost near the river. Another followed a string of break-ins where nothing was taken except photographs from frames. A short column explained that the church on Cedar had once tried to organize a community prayer at the Keller house, but canceled when 2 of the volunteers fell ill on the front steps. The paper avoided words like curse. It used words like unfortunate and ongoing. The librarian lowered her voice to ask if he had known the family. He said no. He asked if anyone had been allowed into the basement when the house was boarded. The librarian paused and said she did not know, and then said she had never seen anyone go in or out for years. On the way home, he stopped at Riggs Hardware and bought a new padlock and a loop of chain and a bag of rock salt because the journal had given him a list, and lists could be useful even when they came from the wrong rooms. He sat at a small table and felt the cool paper of the receipt in his hand and thought about how unreasonable it was to be comforted by an itemized list. He made a plan in slow breathing. He would go back at dusk when the street held more sound. He would put the lock on the chain properly. He would not go down the stairs. He would leave the book under the heavy slab of a toolbox borrowed from the stockroom because the idea of returning the book felt like pulling a nail from a beam that had never squeaked until someone touched it. At 6:12, he stood on the Keller porch with the bag of salt in his left hand and the chain in his right. The door opened like a mouth too willing. The hallway felt the same, the air did not. He could smell metal as clearly as if a handful of pennies had warmed in his palm. He reached the basement door and found the chain as he had left it, but the lock lay on the floor with its body intact and its shackles straight as a finger. The shear had not been made by a tool. He told himself he did not have time to invent what it had been made by. He wound the new chain through both plates and snapped the lock closed. He poured a line of salt along the seam at the bottom of the door. He sprinkled a handful across each stair, and the tiny crystals clicked like sleet. He kept his breathing slow and shallow because he could hear his own breath, and he did not want to hear anything else inside his breath. He left the house and walked to the end of the block and turned around in the middle of the street. He wanted to see whether anything about the house had changed now that he had done something inside it. The sky was a bruised blue, the windows were dull eyes, a single mosquito drifted around his knee, and then the basement window flashed again with a colder light than fluorescent bulbs or phones. He took a step back. The light winked out. He whispered the address in his head and felt the number fall through him like a key. Sunday bled into Monday with thin sleep and thick coffee. He went to work and stocked shampoo and paper towels and metal shelving pins. He tried to think about nothing except the shape of each thing in his hands. On break, he watched the bakery workers frost cupcakes behind glass and imagined a town where basements contained only spiders and paint cans. At 1:59 a.m., his phone vibrated against his thigh where he had set it on a stack of cardboard. The screen lit the inside of the receiving bay like a small moon. No name, no number, just the words withheld and a line of silence when he put it to his ear. He said hello and heard his own breath return twice slower and twice colder than he had sent it out. On Tuesday afternoon, he heard a knock in his own basement. Not a thud, not a settling of the building, a single knock. Then another, the same 2 count as the house on Maple. He walked down his own stairs with the book tucked next to his ribs. The air smelled of dust and laundry soap and something a little sour that might have been old water. He stood with his hand on the light chain, but did not pull it. He told the basement he could hear it. He told the basement he would not open the door at Maple again. He said his own name softly in the middle of a sentence because words can carry names when you slip them safely. At 3:07 a.m., he woke to the radio. Hiss again. And this time, the static had a pattern, like words muffled under a blanket. He listened and told himself what he heard was only the shape of language and not language. Then a word formed that he knew to be his name, even though it did not sound like his name spoken by any person he had ever met. It sounded like someone had written his name on a piece of paper and set that paper on a table and dragged a fingernail under the letters over and over until the paper had worn thin. He took the book to work because he did not want it in the apartment while he slept, and he did not want it in the locker in the break room where other hands might open it. During the quiet part of the shift, he sat on a forklift with the book on his lap and read. The later pages were not entries. They were sentences, like nails. Do not make bargains in the stairwell. Do not agree to anything from the landing. It will tell you that it is not your problem. It will tell you that the ones who kept it locked were cruel. It will tell you that the light in the window means it is weak. It will tell you that if you open the door, it will leave through the front and never return. When you hear it say a name you knew once, understand that it is not that voice and that the person it belongs to is not on the stairs waiting for you to help. He decided to ask someone in uniform for advice, not help. Advice seemed smaller. He walked into the police station on Wednesday, just after noon, and asked at the front desk whether there had been calls about Maple Street. The desk sergeant put his elbows on the counter and said people called about that block every few months, kids and dares and noises. He wrote down the address and nodded to a map on the wall and said a patrol car would swing by. The sergeant asked whether Thomas was a relative of the previous owners. Thomas said no. He said he was concerned about a vacant property and the possibility of people getting inside. He did not mention the journal. He did not mention the marks on the wall. He did not mention how sleep had begun to feel like a room with an unlocked door facing downhill. Later that day, he met Nolan from the stockroom for coffee at the diner with the neon clock in the window. The server called them honey and set down 2 mugs and a plate with pie that tasted like nutmeg and sugar. Thomas told him enough of the story that Nolan's eyes got wide and then smaller, and then Nolan laughed and said a man has to find a better hobby than breaking into houses. Thomas smiled because the conversation felt like folding a blanket neatly after a storm. Nolan said he would walk past the place with him after work for a thrill. Thomas said no very quickly and then softer. Nolan shrugged and said he did not scare easily. Thomas said it was not fear that mattered, it was attention. Some places grew when you looked at them. That night, after the shift ended, they did not walk down Maple. They took Birch and went directly to their apartments. Thomas watched through the blinds until he saw Nolan's living room light come on 2 buildings down. He let his breathing go long and slow. At 2:26 a.m., a thud shook the thin wall between Thomas and the laundry room. Then a sound like someone dragging cardboard across concrete. He stood, and the floor felt like the deck of a boat. He pressed his palm to the wall, and the wall hummed like a tuning fork. He thought of the bricked patch in the Keller cellar and the way the mortar had looked newer, even though nothing in that house should qualify as new. At 2:31 a.m., he heard footsteps on Birch. 2 sets, one heavier and one soft and quick. He looked through the blinds again. Nolan walked fast toward Maple with his phone held like a lantern. Beside him, a shorter shape kept pace. Thomas pulled on shoes and grabbed nothing else because everything else felt like it would slow him down. By the time he reached the corner, Nolan was already on the front steps with the door open, and the shorter figure had slipped inside. Thomas swallowed the taste of metal and followed. The hallway did not so much welcome them as forget to stop them. At the basement door, the chain lay in a loose curve on the floor, and one end of it was black as if it had spent time in smoke. The door leaned off its swollen frame, and in the gap, Thomas could see the top 3 stairs like vertebrae in a spine. Nolan said he had heard his sister's voice on the phone. He said the voice had stopped speaking when he stood near his kitchen sink, and then he had heard it at his back, as if the phone had turned into a mouth. He said she had sounded like she had when they were little and scared on storm nights. He said she had asked him whether he remembered the basement of their childhood home and the way he would count the steps out loud to calm her. He said he had come to count these steps and make a joke of it. He said he would call her as soon as he showed the scary old house that he could walk downstairs without shaking. The shorter figure that had slipped inside had gone down ahead of him. Thomas did not see it then, in a way his mind would let him examine. He would decide later that there are shapes meant only to be noticed by the back of the eyes. He reached out and placed his palm on Nolan's forearm. The skin was cold, as if he had been outside in winter. Nolan looked at him, and the look was the look of a man who has already decided to do a thing and is only waiting to be allowed to begin. Thomas saw the strange softness in the corners of his mouth. He said they would stand on the landing only. He said they would count to 10 and then go up again. He said they would not say any names. He said they would not answer anything they heard. They stepped down. The air on the stairs did not feel like cold air. It felt like the absence of a smell and the absence of warmth and the absence of a sound hitting a wall and returning. The light from their phones found the same jam jars and the same workbench and the same carved symbols. It found the bricked patch. It found scuff marks in the dust where something had traced a circle around the table and then stopped and then traced a circle in the opposite direction. The radio hiss came from nowhere and everywhere. Under it, other noises rose like small things in a drawer trying to slide to the front. They stood on the landing. They counted. 1 to 10 took longer than it should and shorter than they wanted. As they reached 9, a voice rose from the bottom stair, thin with distance but near his breath. It said a word like help, elongated to twice the length that word normally wears. Nolan's face changed like a surface when a reflection moves across it. Thomas gripped Nolan's forearm where the pulse tapped hard. He said the list in the book again. Do not answer. Do not bargain. Do not take a single step down after you promised yourself you would not. At 9.5, the voice said a different sound. Not help. A nickname Thomas understood to belong to a boy in a kitchen long ago. Nolan almost laughed because happiness and grief sometimes look the same when they arrive at exactly the wrong time. He leaned forward 1 inch and the stair under his foot clicked the way wood does when it admits weight. Something turned its head at the bottom. The air tilted. Thomas dragged him back with both arms and hit the door with his shoulder and swung it closed and shoved the chain through with fumbling hands. The thing on the other side stepped up 3 stairs with the sound of 1 step. The door pushed against his back like a slow wave. The chain pulled against the plates. The lock took his shaking and held. He and Nolan stood with their foreheads almost touching because there was nowhere else to look. Nolan's eyes watered as if he stood in bright sunlight. The pushing against the door stopped, but the sound did not. The sound became a long, soft rubbing against wood. Then nothing. Then a knock. The same one, and then 2. The heavy breath passed into the hall and receded. He did not listen at the seam. He walked backward with the book tucked to his chest and the lock pinched in his fingers like a coin. Outside the night was not a relief. The sky hung still as the inside of a cupboard. They walked without speaking to Birch. When they reached Nolan's building, he said he would call his sister. He said he would not tell her where he had been. His mouth trembled like the waterline of a lake when a boat has long gone by. Thomas nodded and did not say, "Be careful," because words turn into loose nails when you need beams. He went home and sat on his kitchen floor and leaned his head against the cabinet. He fell asleep there for a few minutes or an hour. He woke to his phone, flashing a sliver of light on the ceiling and buzzing without a name. He did not answer. The book lay on the linoleum, open to the page with the list. He traced 1 line with a finger until the letters warmed under his skin. He stood and filled a bowl with salt and went to his own basement door and poured a thin white seam. He whispered that he would keep the door closed because there are doors you close for your own safety, and there are doors you close for the safety of others, and sometimes they are the same door. On Thursday, in the wet heat of afternoon, he found Mara, the librarian, at her desk. He asked a different question. He asked whether she knew anything about a bricked area in the Keller cellar. She swallowed and said she did not, and then she did the thing a helpful person does when small talk is no longer a good coat. She said her uncle had done drywall for the town years ago and had gone to the Keller place once. He had refused to step below the top stair. He had come home and said he had felt a small wind blowing on his fingers from under the door like the breath of something close to the floor. He had said a family before the Kellers had built a wall to hide a well that had once been in the cellar, a well that did not lead to groundwater, a well that led to something else. The town had filled wells before. Old ones that calves fell into or that swallowed loose ash. They had never filled that one with dirt. They had put stones and boards across it and then built a wall to force themselves to forget. Thomas thanked her and walked out into sun that felt like heavy milk. He bought a sledgehammer and a chisel at the hardware store because doing nothing had begun to feel like opening a door by standing very still near it. He told himself he would go at first light when the birds made a lot of honest noise. He told himself he would knock 3 bricks out and then decide what next to do. He told himself that breaking open the seal would be the first step to resealing it properly. He did not tell himself that people who open things often believe closing them will be much easier than it is. At 5:1 a.m. on Friday, he stood on the stairs to the Keller cellar with the sledge in both hands. He took 2 steps down and stopped because the air below smelled like wet pennies and old paper. He took 1 more step and planted his feet as if he stood in a canoe. He swung the sledge in a small, controlled arc because there was nowhere to widen. The head met the brick with a noise that felt like biting down hard on a fork. A shard dropped and skittered across the floor. He swung again. Mortar dust rose and lived in his nose and throat. A third swing loosened a brick the size of his hand. He pried it out and set it down, and his skin did not want to release it. The hole was a mouth as high as his shin and as wide as his palm. He put his ear near, but not to it. He heard nothing at first. He heard a sound, then like distant wind through trees. He realized there were no trees underground. He realized the sound was very quiet and very close, and not wind. He widened the hole by one more brick because stopping at one felt like a kind of insult that would be answered in a language he did not speak. Through the opening, the dark was not flat. It bent inward like the first step into an elevator shaft. A small rush of cold kissed his knuckles. The smell of iron deepened. He lifted his phone and put the light to the gap. The beam went 5 feet down and then met a shape that reflected light like wet glass. Water lay in a still black circle, waiting for the phone light to land on it so it could pretend to be the sky. A ring of old wood ended where the water began. Iron spikes rimmed the wood like teeth that had lost some but not all of their neighbors. They were wired together with thin strands of dark metal. Small bells dangled on 2 of the wires. He had seen such bells tied to doorknobs at Christmas in houses that wanted to be visited. Here, they were a warning for the inside, a stop for the upward motion of anything that wanted to climb. He heard then a note from one of the bells, so soft he might have dreamed it while awake. Not a jingle, a tart, faint sound like the first sound a glass makes when a finger finds it. He felt the stair under him tilt a hair. He stepped back and hit the wall with his shoulder, and the sledge swung low and knocked the edge of the table, and the leather book slid an inch and settled. He wanted to put the bricks back with gentle hands. He wanted to push them into place like the way you tuck a child into bed. He realized with a clarity that hurt that the wall had not been built to keep people away from the well. It had been built to make time pass more smoothly above it. He whispered, "Keep it locked," and the words did not feel like superstition. They felt like a simple instruction for a tool with teeth. He placed the first brick and the second, and his breath shortened as if he had been running. The mortar he had brought in a plastic tub went on with a butter knife, and the work looked clumsy and young next to the smooth line he had broken. He set the third brick and tapped it and heard the bell below speak again. It sounded like laughter that had not learned the joke. The room changed then, the way a room changes when another person steps into it behind you. He felt a small pressure at his lower back that might have been cold air climbing. He stood, and the phone light swung and found a wet track on the floor, leading from the bricked patch to the foot of the stairs, and then stopping as if a careful stopper had put a palm down and said no farther for now. He lifted the salt bag and poured a thick ribbon across the track. The grains hung in the air for a half second as if tasting, and then fell. He stepped to the door and pulled it shut and fed the chain through and clicked the lock. He pressed his head to the wood. The other side felt like a tongue pressed to the back of teeth. He kept Friday small. He sat in his apartment with the radio unplugged and the book on top of the refrigerator because the higher the object, the less likely it felt to reach up. At 3 a.m. The floor knocked under his feet twice. He said he heard it. He said he was not answering. He said his name inside a word that did not belong to him. Saturday felt like walking through someone else's house while they slept in the next room. At one point, 04 p.m., the laundromat dryer, 2 doors down, stopped mid-cycle and no quarters fell through the slot. He heard a sound like someone blowing across the mouth of a bottle. He ate a sandwich without tasting it. He fell asleep at 7 and woke at 11 because the building sighed, and then he realized that he had not heard the building sigh so humanly before. He walked to Maple and stood across the street in the empty midnight like a piece of furniture on the curb. The house wore its shadow evenly. A stray cat moved across the yard and did not glance at the window well. He went home and sat at the table and turned the book to the last page again. In pencil so faint he could have missed it, a final line waited. If it leaves the hole, it will not want to go far at first. It will want a basement with stairs. It can count. It will want a place. It can learn the shape of your footsteps. It will want to know the names you say when you are too tired to think. Give it none. Give it nothing. Give it back the dark. On Sunday evening, a storm rose the way summer storms do, angry in the distance, and then in the living room all at once. Rain hit the sidewalk like rice, lightning pressed white against the blinds. The basement under his apartment breathed cool and close, as if the storm had opened something in it. He considered calling someone and could not think who. He tried to imagine how he would explain a well that did not want water. He told himself he would give it back the dark, and he picked up the hammer he kept near his own door and the bag of salt and the book, because the book had been with him for each hour that mattered, and that kind of company counts for something. At 8 a.m., he stood again in the Keller hall. The chandelier strained with a seam of light from the storm. The basement door looked bigger, and at the same time tight with its own edges. He placed the book on the first stair because some objects understand where they should be set. He ran his palm along the chain. He touched the lock. The wood felt dry under his hand even as rain sang outside. He opened the door only enough to breathe. He spoke to the dark the way you speak to a dog that is backed under a bed. He said he would bring bricks and new mortar tomorrow at noon. He said he would finish the job before the next sun slid down. He said he would not listen to anything but the sound of the trowel and the bell and his own counting. He said he would not be fooled by names in familiar shapes. The next morning, at 11:02, he stood in the aisle at Riggs and bought 2 bags of mix and a new trowel and a pair of gloves. The kid at the counter asked if he had a project. He said yes, and then laughed because the word project landed like a paper airplane in a place where there was no air. He carried the buckets to Maple in 2 trips and felt each trip cut through the heat. He set the first bucket on the porch and then turned back for the second. When he looked again after crossing the street, the bucket had shifted an inch to the left toward the door. He did not go to it quickly. He walked slow and placed the second bucket next to the first, and both were still. He told himself that the porch was uneven and the wood had remembered how to be a ramp in rain. Before he could begin, he saw Deputy Hawkins step out of a cruiser and lift a hand. The deputy had a face that looked older when he was listening. He said there had been a noise complaint last night from 2 streets over. He asked whether Thomas was a contractor. Thomas said no. He said he was a neighbor. The deputy said the town was thinking of condemning the house for real this time and clearing the lot because of kids and fires and liabilities. He said they would get a crew in the next month. He asked whether Thomas had been inside. Thomas looked at the buckets. He looked at the deputy. He said the house had a problem, and it was old, and it did not save receipts. The deputy studied him the way a man studies a map he does not trust. He said to be careful and to call if he saw anyone else trying to go down there. He said the last thing he needed was a group of teenagers going missing because they like a dare. He drove off slowly, watching his mirrors. Thomas worked. He worked in the way that gets inside the skull and quiets it. He pulled 3 bricks and scraped the hole smooth and widened it to square. He looked down and saw the bells waiting like sleeping birds. He poured the first thin wall of mix and set in a brick and pressed. He heard a tiny note from the bell and set the next brick and pressed. He counted the seconds on his phone and pressed again. He waited for the line to take. He spread more and pressed, and when the sound came again, he said he did not hear it. The air thinned. The skin of his neck crawled as if a small hand tested his hair. He did not reach up. He set another brick. The first bucket emptied, and he fetched the second. He moved through the kitchen and imagined the Kellers cooking breakfast in a house that held itself tighter each day around them. He imagined a woman pressing a note into a book because the walls needed more words to stay closed. He returned to the hole, and the smell of iron had softened, and the bells had gone quiet. He set 4 more bricks. He pressed with the flat of his gloved hand and felt the resistance of something that did not like to be touched, but did not know how to avoid it when it came from the right angle with the right pressure and the right not listening. By 2:49 p.m., the hole had become, again, a seam. His work did not match the old work, but it held the way 2 hands can hold, even when one is small. He poured thin salt water into the mortar and watched the line drink. He took the book and set it on the table and put both palms on the cover and said what he had learned to say. Keep it locked, do not answer. Give it back the dark. He walked up into the bright, hard day, and the world felt flat and real and ordinary in a way that made him almost giddy. He laughed once, and the laugh sounded like air finding a pocket that had been sealed. He locked the house door behind him and felt for the first time that the lock belonged to a house and not to a throat. The nights after that were not empty. Nothing goes back to what it was before. But the knocks in his own basement softened to the sound of a building remembering itself. The radio hissed once, and then never again. He slept 3 hours in a row, then 4. He left the book on a high shelf and did not touch it unless he had to move the ladder. He checked Maple each morning on his way home when the sun pressed yellow on the pavement. The basement window held nothing but his own reflection looking down. 2 weeks later, the town posted a bright notice on a stake in the front yard that said work order and a lot number and a date. A week after that, a crew in hard hats and shirts with logos put up a new fence with a padlock and took photographs and measured with a wheel. They nodded and ate sandwiches on the curb, and Thomas watched them leave with the slow relief of someone realizing that the storm had moved far enough away that thunder could be remembered as a story and not a present tense. The night before the demolition was scheduled, he woke at 3:11 a.m. with a clear thought sitting in his mind like a person in a chair. He dressed, he put on boots, he put the book in his backpack, he walked down Maple in the hush that happens before the first bird remembers to be a bird. He climbed the fence because the lock on a fence is a lock on a line, and sometimes a line wants to be stepped over. He stood on the porch and listened. Inside the house, the air smelled like wood and old sugar. The basement door waited with its chain and lock and seam of salt that had turned into a white ribbon glued to the floor by summer damp. He put his palm flat to the wood, and he could feel nothing there for the first time. No breath, no push, no distant bell. He unlocked the chain. He opened the door just enough to whisper the number of days since he had reset the wall. He said he had done what he could with the hands he had. He said the work would be loud tomorrow and then quiet. He said if silence could be a promise, he was making it as best he could. As he turned to go up, he heard a sound that did not make his stomach jump. A small clink like china being set gently on a shelf. He smiled and closed the door and set the chain without hurry. On the porch, he stood very still and looked at the first slice of gray behind the trees. He realized he was crying, small silent tears like condensation. He wiped them away and did not bother to explain to himself why. The machines came mid-morning. A backhoe took the porch first, and the men shouted the easy words of work that goes as planned. When the bucket took the first bite of the front wall, a dark dust rose, and the driver lifted a hand for a brake while it cleared. Thomas stood across the street with coffee cooling in his hand. He told himself that someday this would be a flat lot with grass and perhaps a new house that would never teach its owners new meanings for the word below. The basement walls came last. The crew hesitated with the hole in the ground. They discussed a plan with gestures that did not reach the street. In the end, they filled the cavity with crushed stone and concrete. The driver said, if a man cannot see his reflection in a thing, it is less likely to think it is a mirror. The foreman laughed and shook his head. They smoothed the surface and left orange cones the way sailors leave lights. That evening, Thomas walked to the fresh slab and stood on it. The concrete held his weight without talking. He imagined the well under layers of stone and powder and weight. He imagined the bells caught forever in a mix of sand and water and Portland cement. He imagined that sound traveling up through solid rock and not finding any ears, because some sounds do not need to be heard to know that they have stopped. He went home and put the book in a box with a tight lid and carried it to a storage unit out by the highway where units sit like teeth in a long, quiet mouth. He signed the paper and set the box on a top shelf and felt the strange lightness that comes when you put something heavy where it belongs. Weeks passed. The town forgot in the way towns do. Someone painted the laundromat door a new blue. The neon clock at the diner stopped flickering. Maple Street at night smelled like cut grass and a little like gasoline when the crews moved their trucks. Thomas went to work at night and came home near morning. He counted the steps to his own basement sometimes as he passed the door, because counting can be a kind of prayer and a kind of promise. On a Sunday evening in late heat and long shadows, he took a walk toward the river. On the way back, he felt the pull of the old address, and he turned down Maple so that he could confirm a thing he already knew. The lot where the house had stood was a smooth gray shape with a skin of dust and two small weeds already testing the edge. He stood at the curb and thought about how people say ground takes what you give it. He thought about how some gifts are heavy and some are not, and how sometimes the only difference is a chain and a lock, and a person who will set the chain again when it loosens. The night rose like a slow tide, the cicadas wound up, a car hissed past. He turned to go, and in the corner of his eye, he saw a pulse of pale light. He went very still. He let his head turn slowly until he looked square at the place where the old basement window had been. There was nothing there now but concrete the color of chalk. The light did not come from the ground. It came from the storm drain at the edge of the curb. A small square of water reflected something not present in the sky. It pulsed once, twice. It went still. He stood without moving. He did not lean closer. He did not speak to the water. He reached in his pocket and found 3 grains of salt that had worked their way into the seam of the fabric and lodged there for weeks. He dropped them at his feet and watched them vanish into the dust. At home, he sat at the table without turning on the light and listened to the hum of the refrigerator and the slow click of the cooling pipes. He waited for the radio that was not plugged in to make a noise, and it did not. He slept and dreamed of a field covered in frost that did not melt when the sun rose. He woke at 6:12 a.m. exactly without an alarm, and knew that sometimes a thing stays locked because a person decides each day to keep it that way. He did not go back to the storage unit for a long time. When he finally did, the box on the top shelf was as he had left it. He brought it down and set it on the concrete floor and touched the lid and then left it closed. He lifted the box and put it back in its place, because some stories work better as weight than as words. He walked out into heat that smelled like tar and rain. He breathed and felt the breath go all the way in and all the way out without catching on a nail or a bell or a stair. He went home on Birch and stepped over his own basement door the way a person steps over a sleeping dog. He remembered the list and understood that it was not a list of rules. It was a list of choices a person could lay out each day like tools. He turned on the coffee. He waited for it to finish. He stood and listened to nothing that he did not invite. He said a sentence without names and without bargains. He said the simple truth of the street and the house and the whole. Some doors must stay closed. Some doors are not doors. The basement on Maple taught him both. He keeps that lesson like a lock in the pocket of whatever he wears, cool to the touch, easy to hold, heavy enough to matter. And on nights when the air goes too quiet, he looks toward the part of town where concrete lies like a lid, and he counts to 10 very slowly, the way a person might count steps in the dark. He keeps counting until morning touches the windows. He keeps counting until the house inside him stays locked. He keeps counting until the world answers with nothing at all. Why did they all vanish overnight? The road into Shaw Ridge wound along a narrow river and then climbed through oak and pine until the pavement narrowed to a single faded lane. People in the county used to joke that you did not find Shaw Ridge on purpose. You took a wrong turn after the feed store, or your phone lost signal, or the fog on the river made you miss the better road. Then suddenly there it was, a little town cupped in a bowl of trees, porch lights glowing warm against the blue shape of the hills. It felt like a place that did not mind if the world forgot it. In truth, the world mostly had. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it there? On a Monday before dawn, Nolan Pike guided his delivery truck over the bridge and into Main Street. He had been hauling flour and canned goods to the Ridge Diner since he was old enough to shave. He liked the routine, and he liked how the cook always slid him a plate of scrambled eggs even when the kitchen was slammed. That morning, everything looked normal. Porch lights buzzed. A television flickered in a living room above the hardware store. 2 dogs argued across the street and then gave up with sleepy barks. Nolan stacked the boxes by the back door of the diner, took the signed slip from the night manager, and rolled back out while the tree line still held the last of the stars. He waved at a man in a reflective vest by the water plant. The man raised his hand without enthusiasm. Nothing about the quiet felt wrong. By the next sunrise, the town had changed. A state trooper named Lila Benton slowed at the crossroads because her dashboard compass spun for half a mile and then steadied again, a thing it had never done. She came in expecting fog, deer, maybe a fallen limb. She parked near the diner and walked in with her hat tucked under her arm. She called a good morning and waited for the sound of a chair scraping back. The booths sat empty. Plates of breakfast waited on the counter as if everyone had stepped out. Hash browns were cooling on a skillet without a flame. Coffee steamed faintly and made little clouds in the cold air from the open door. A radio behind the register whispered a song that drifted into static and then back again. Lila stood with her hands on the counter and listened. She heard the kitchen fan, the quiet cling of a spoon, the soft tick of the clock above the pie case. She did not hear a single breath that belonged to a human being. She stepped outside with the hairs on her arms standing up. A tricycle lay in the street beside the barber shop, the back wheel still turning. The barber pole spun without light. The laundromat door was open and a washer hummed with a full load of jeans going in circles. The little hardware store had its cash drawer half open with bills still in it. Lila called the county and then she called again. Her voice sounded too loud and then too small. Birds did not sing. The wind came off the ridge and smelled like old coins. By mid-morning, the sheriff from the county seat arrived with deputies and volunteers. They went door to door and then house to house. Every place told the same story. Meals sat half-eaten. A pair of glasses rested on a novel turned face down. A hot iron lay on a towel without burning a mark. A page of a crossword was filled until the last square and then abandoned. A Sunday dress hung on a closet door, but no shoes waited below it. Pets were left on the wrong side of doors and had clawed them in panic and then stopped. A little parakeet watched the searchers from a cage by a window and fluffed its feathers with slow grief. They found no bodies. They found no footprints. They found no sign that a single person had fought anyone or anything. It was as if the whole town had stood up and stepped out into thin air. The command post went into the community hall. The building smelled like lemon oil and old trophies. Folding tables filled with maps, radios, and stacks of forms. The sheriff, a patient woman named Drea Collier, kept a legal pad on the table and wrote down every odd thing, no matter how foolish it sounded. Numbers were important when the ground moved under your feet. At dusk, Drea sent teams into the surrounding hills. The search dogs balked at the tree line and put their bellies to the ground. Their handlers coaxed and pleaded. One dog tried to bite through its leash to get back to the truck. The teams went in. Without the dogs, the forest swallowed them. Radios crackled and hissed. A volunteer named Brooks heard a long, low tone roll through the trees like something far away calling. He tried to radio in. His voice sounded as if he had cupped his hand over his mouth from the other end of the county. At the school, someone had left a message. The chalk dust on the slate told them it had not been written long ago. The words were big and uneven. They read simply, "Do not follow us." There were no prints in the dust on the floor. The windows were shut. The door was locked from the inside. Deputy Lila stood with her hand near the writing. For so long, her arm shook. Something about the letters felt rushed and also careful, the way a person writes when they know time is thin. Reporters came, and then they kept coming. The first ones were local and arrived with notepads and coffee in paper cups. The next wave brought vans with dishes that rose like metal flowers. A journalist out of the city walked the center line of Main Street with a camera operator backing away from him. He tried to make a joke on air and lost his place in the sentence. People watched from living rooms 3 states away and leaned in when he spoke the words every one of them had formed in their heads. How can this be? He looked over the top of the camera, and something made him step back with his hand up. The camera stayed steady and caught nothing but the empty street and the way the light bent near the trees like heat above a road. Federal investigators arrived with instruments that hummed and blinked. They tested the water, they tested the air, they asked for records from the clinic, and studied them for patterns. They found nothing that fit. Not a leak from the plant, not a cult with a bus and a plan, not anything that could carry away a whole town without leaving a mark. They took samples of soil from the edge of the woods. One lab tech wrote in a margin that the iron content was higher than the sample a mile downriver. Another circled a reading from a small handheld meter that liked to jump and stay high and then go back to normal as if embarrassed to be noticed. Nolan came back on Wednesday because he could not stand not to. He parked by the bridge and walked in on foot. The air felt thick. His boots seemed to stick to the asphalt every time he lifted them. He stood in the diner kitchen and looked at the flour he had dropped off 2 days before. The bags were torn open, but they had not been moved. A line of powder ran across the tile and ended at the back door. He remembered the man with the vest at the water plant. The hand half raised, the slow wave. Nolan looked down at his own hand and saw that it was shaking. He reminded himself out loud that he was not a child. His voice sounded like he had put his head in a cardboard box. That night, the sheriff allowed a small team to stay in the diner with recorders and notepads. The team included Lila, a federal tech named Mateo, who had already built a map of the power grid from memory, a volunteer pastor named Ruth, and a park ranger named Blake who knew every ridge and gully for 20 miles. They propped the front door and sat in a booth with a coffee that none of them drank. At 11, a tone came through the jukebox, though no one had touched it. It was not a song. It was a single note, like a pipe in a cave. The lights dimmed and then brightened. In the window, something moved. It did not have a shape that a person could name. The air outside looked thicker there for one slow breath and then cleared again. At 1 in the morning, they heard footsteps on the street. They all turned at once. The steps did not come closer. They walked and turned and walked again as if whoever owned them could not decide whether to approach. Lila stood and called hello. The word felt wrong in her mouth, like a prayer spoken backward. The steps stopped. When they resumed, they belonged to more than one person. The team did not open the door. The sound passed the diner and went toward the school. Later, when Lila gathered herself and went outside, she found 3 damp footprints near the curb. They began and ended on dry concrete. 3 days after the first search, a ham radio operator named Elliot Crane drove up with a rig in the bed of his pickup. He was the kind of man who could coax a signal out of a dead battery with a soda can and a length of wire. He set up behind the hardware store because the alley was open to the sky. He swept the dial through a swath of frequencies until he felt the hairs on his knuckles rise as if a storm had moved in. Then he heard it, a carrier that rose and fell like breathing. He spoke into the mic. He gave his call sign and then the name of the town. The carrier did not break. It swelled. A whisper came through as if he had pressed his ear hard to a door. It said one word that the deputies argued about for the rest of the summer. Some heard it as stay, some heard it as away. Elliot went home and took to sleeping on the couch with the radio on a crate at his feet. He swore that the sound followed him out of the valley, as if it had tasted his voice and wanted to see where he lived. The stories from the last day began to surface. A clerk from a gas station 15 miles away remembered a young girl in a red jacket who ran in just before dark and begged to use the phone. She said her brother was home alone and she could not get her mother to answer. She dialed with shaking hands and listened, and then said hello in a voice that did not sound like a question. She hung up and stood in the doorway for a long moment, like a person who has just remembered where they put something important. Then she walked back out and stood on the curb and looked toward the hills. The clerk did not remember seeing a car pull away. He told the deputy that he simply looked again and she was gone, as if the space she had used had never been occupied by anyone. A man who ran the bait shop by the lake said he heard singing late that night, a kind of low choir. He thought it was teenagers and decided to drive over and tell them to cut it out. When he put his hand on the doorknob, he felt 3 soft taps from the other side of the wood. He opened the door anyway. The lot was empty. The singing drifted away toward the dam. He went back inside and found that all the minnows in the tank had turned in a slow circle to face the same corner. In the morning, the minnows were fine again and wanted to eat. He was not. The oldest person in the county, a woman named June Avery, wrote a letter to her niece and dated it with only the day of the week. The post office took a picture for a human interest story after she turned 100 followers. June had known the ridge since wagons still used the river stones to cross when the water was low. Her letter said this: "We have had a hum in the valley for as long as we have had a road. People used to talk about it when the weather went still. They called it a gate as a way to put a word on a thing that did not have edges. A few men got lost once when I was a girl. The searchers found them standing at the old quarry with their eyes on something down inside the water that should have been too dark to see. They came back home and would not say what they had looked at. They would not look at anything small ever again. They used to keep their eyes on the horizon like sailors." June did not vanish with the others. She had moved to a nursing home the year before. She died a few weeks after the town emptied. The nurse said she opened her eyes at 4 in the morning and said it stopped, and then let her last breath out as if the body were a door that had been held closed too long. A federal team ran a drone over the ridge. The live feed showed rooftops and 2 church steeples and a little football field where the grass had run to patchy brown. The drone drifted toward the far tree line and then lost signal in a circle so well defined you could draw it on a map. The drone fell like a gull hit by a stone and did not make a sound when it landed. When a ranger hiked to the spot, he found the drone lying on needles with one propeller still turning slowly. He felt a tug in his chest that made his eyes water. He picked up the machine and walked backward out of the trees because he did not trust his legs to turn his body around. Investigators built a timeline. People had baked bread, people had filled their trucks, students had scrawled notes and drawn shapes with bored hands. At about 9 at night, phones in town placed calls to numbers that mattered. Those calls connected. On the recordings, you could hear breath and the sound of someone on the other end listening, and then the call ended in a neat click. At a little after 2, the street cameras caught a fog that thickened in pockets and then slid like water being pushed by a hand. The fog pooled at intersections and under the school steps and along the front of the diner. The fog did not behave the way a fog behaves. It stayed where it wanted. It lifted when it wanted. It did not care about wind. At 2:17, every clock that used a battery in town stopped at the same tick. The ones that used the wall power did not. A volunteer named Quinn took notes on everything that felt small and wrong. He wrote that the flag on the pole by the hall did not move, even though the line of pines behind it bowed. He wrote that a crow put its feet on the roof of the post office and sat down like an old man and did not take off for a long time. He wrote that a smell rose from the grass when the fog lifted. It smelled like pennies and also like moss near a spring. He wrote that if he looked at the line of woods too long, he forgot what he had just been doing. When he read his notes later, there were gaps where he had jumped a line and left an empty space and then resumed the sentence. He did not remember lifting his pen. The last person to see the townsfolk as townsfolk might have been the night watchman at the water plant. His name was Hank, and he was a quiet man. His sister told a deputy that he used to hum hymns when he played cards. He called the county line at 11 with a simple report: "You have got some kind of weather over here, but the radar is clean." The line went silent and then picked up again, and Hank said, "I can see them." When the dispatcher asked who, he said everyone. Then he said, "They are not in a line." Then he said, "They are not looking at me." Then he said, "I am going to lock the door." The recording ends with the sound of a latch sliding home. The door stood open when Lila got there the next day. The lock was undamaged. There were 2 sets of keys on a hook by the frame. Both sets were hanging there. I drove in at dusk, a month after the first day. I am not a detective. I write and I listen, and sometimes people answer the phone when I call. I had kept my distance because I thought distance was respectful, and because I thought the thing in the valley did not want to be watched. In the end, the silence pulled me like tide. I left my car on the far side of the bridge and carried a small recorder and a paper notebook. I felt foolish walking into a place I could not explain to myself. Main Street felt wider than it had on the news, the way a sanctuary feels wider when you stand in it alone. I walked past the barbershop. past the bench in front of the hardware store where a half-finished whittling lay on the slats. The diner door was unlocked. I went in and stood by the counter and listened. The air made a low sound that did not come from any machine I could see. It was a tone you feel in your ribs and in the bridge of your nose. The jukebox was off. The clock above the pies had stopped at 2:17 and then had been wound again by some deputy who had not wanted to look at it any longer in that position. I put my recorder on the counter and pressed the red button and told it the time so that I would not betray myself later and pretend that I had not meant to do this. Night came not in a rush, but in layers. The streetlights stuttered and then climbed to brightness. The trees around the town looked like a dark tide ring. I stood on the diner steps and smelled the air and felt the temperature drop. A sound rose from the end of the street. It was not footsteps. It was the sound of many people standing from chairs at the same time. The hairs on my neck prickled, and I stepped back inside even though I had not meant to do that. I steadied myself on the counter. I told myself that I would count to 30 and then step back out like a person with a normal sense of courage. I reached 12 when a shape crossed the window. It was not a person. It was the absence of a person, like a cutout moved along glass. Another shape followed it. Another passed in the other direction. I stood with my hand on the counter and counted again. My mouth had gone dry. When I finally walked out, the street was empty. The fog that did not behave like fog had gathered at the corner by the school. It had not come from the river or from the field. It had arrived the way a thought arrives when your guard is down. The chalkboard inside the school was visible through the door window if I stood on the steps. The message was still there in its first form. Do not follow us. I told myself that I would not. I told myself I had not come to cross any line. I do not know who I was trying to convince. At 2 in the morning, the low tone grew stronger. My teeth ached. The power in the streetlights thinned and made a ring around each lamp like a faint halo that pulled away and then settled. I walked to the middle of the street and stood under the light out of an instinct as old as campfires. I looked toward the woods and saw what every person who had ever stepped into this valley must have seen when the hour was right. The line between trees moved like breath. Not wind, breath. The dark changed shade, pale and then deep and then pale again. The fog gathered itself and unspooled a path across the asphalt toward the school steps. It did not slide like smoke. It built itself like a road. There were impressions in it. The impressions were not feet, and yet I knew that feet had made them. I took one step toward it. My heel left the safety of the manhole cover where I had planted myself without thinking. The cover hummed under my boot. I lifted my toe. Something like a pressure against my chest told me to stop. The chalk words were in my mind, clear as a voice. Do not follow us. I said it out loud, not as a spell, not as anything wise, but as a thing to break the hold of the hour. Do not follow us. The fog quivered like a thought that has been interrupted. A sound, like a breath being held, moved across the street. I stepped back, and then back again. The fog did not pursue me. It thinned at the edges and then pooled again by the steps. I felt no heat and no cold from it. I felt only a pull like the sea at your knees. I turned and walked away without running because I did not want to know what the running would invite. Down by the river, I sat on the curb with the recorder in my hand. The red light was still on. I clicked stop and felt foolish for the ceremony of it. I drove out while the night was still heavy. On the bridge, the compass in my dash spun a half turn and then steadied the way it had for Lila on that first day. On the highway, the radio in my car went silent and then came back with a preacher talking about a garden and a gate. I turned it off and drove in quiet and watched the pale line of morning approach like the edge of paper being slid over a dark surface. Back at my apartment, I listened to the recording alone with the blinds shut. I heard the first minutes clearly, my shoes on tile, my breath steady, the words I had said to mark the time. Then the tone entered. It rose and fell. It did not sound like a tone from a machine. It sounded like a tone from a throat that had learned something about singing that people do not know. I heard the scrape of my boots as I braced against the counter. I heard the word I said when I stepped outside. I heard my second set of steps slow. Then I heard something I did not do. My voice spoke in a whisper I do not remember making. It said all at once. The words were not a sentence, they were a collection. Names, the water plant, the quarry, the line of trees, the school steps, the pie clock, the tricycle, the breath, the gate. The last word was a breath that had been shaped into a word so gently that a person listening might think they had imagined it. Home. I sent copies to two people I trusted. One was a sound engineer for a local station who had more patience than caution. He called to say that the file had a layer under it like a ghost of an old tape. He said the word ghost and then apologized. He said he could remove the layer and let me hear the raw voice. He sent me a cut an hour later. I listened to it and heard nothing at all for 10 seconds, and then heard a shape of air that held its form the way water holds the shape of a jar. I deleted the file. I do not know why I did that. It felt like throwing a glass into a sink to stop it from breaking in your hand. The other person was a ranger named Blake who had been in the diner that first night with the team. He left me a message after midnight. He said that the trail by the quarry had been posted with new signs and a chain. He said he had walked the boundary twice, and it had felt like walking a circle around a sleeping animal. He said that if I came back, we would walk to the line and look out, and then we would turn around and go home. He said it as if speaking the plan made it law. The town of Shaw Ridge stands empty. The diner is locked now. The school door has boards over the window. The chalk message still exists behind the boards. Deputies check it the way families check the face of a sleeping child. The clocks run when someone winds them. When no one winds them, they stop at the same minute again. The county mows the grass on the football field twice a season and leaves the edges by the trees to grow tall. Elliot keeps his radio by the couch and turns it on at dusk and pretends to sleep. He hears the carrier rise and fall. He hears the whisper that might be stay and might be away. He does not answer. He says that is the only rule that matters. People who drive the county roads at night will tell you they see porch lights in the trees where there are no houses. People who fish below the dam will tell you that the surface can look like a floor even when the current is strong. People will tell you they wake at 2:17 and hold their breath for a count and then let it out without knowing why. They do not want answers. They want the hour to pass. Sometimes a car stops on the shoulder by the bridge, and a person gets out and walks to the center of the span and puts a hand on the rail and looks into the dark. They are the kind who cannot leave a story alone. They are me, and they are you. They stand with their hand on metal that has known winter and summer and the weight of trucks. They feel a tremor in the bones of the bridge that might be traffic on a road far away and might be something breathing. They think a thought they will not write down. Then they go home. That is the part of the story that matters more than the rest. You go home, you do not follow, you let Shaw Ridge keep its people wherever they went, and you let the valley keep its hum. The sheriff keeps the legal pad in a drawer. The list of odd things is long. It has coffee that stayed warm too long. It has dogs that hid under trucks. It has a crow that sat like a man. It has a drone that fell without sound. It has a chalkboard with a sentence that acts like a fence. When she locks the drawer at night, she rests her hand on the wood a moment longer than she needs to. She is not a superstitious woman. She is a woman who has learned respect as if it were a craft. When the wind is right, the ridge sends a low tone down the river. It lingers by the bridge and then moves along the water. People hear it and think of a train that is very far away and yet also near. They go about their lives, they set out plates, they fold shirts, they check the locks. They do these things without knowing why each movement feels a little careful. The town remains, nestled in its bowl of trees, held by a shape that is not on any map. The day will come when someone steps across the line because they cannot stand not to. The world is full of brave people and also of foolish ones. I hope they remember the words on the slate. I hope they speak them out loud. I hope the valley lets them go. What happened in Shaw Ridge happened at night while clocks trembled and a fog made a road where no road had been. It carried a whole town into a place with no furniture for our ideas. No bulletins were posted that could ease it. No puzzle could be solved to close it. We are left with a street where plates cooled and a bridge where the compass spins. We are left with a message that feels like a hand placed gently against your chest. Do not follow us. And so we do not. We stand at the bridge and listen to the hum, and then we go home. And on the way, we watch the trees and think they look like a crowd that has decided to keep a promise forever. A simple camping trip turned into pure horror. It began as an easy plan on a Thursday afternoon, a fast message thread among 5 friends who had not seen the stars together since college. The idea sounded clean and healthy. 2 nights in the Allegheny National Forest, a site near Kinsua Creek, a little fire, a lot of silence. Then home by Sunday evening with that clear air feeling in the lungs. Nolan booked the permit number by phone, Brooke double-checked the maps, June promised a new camp stove, Priya handled food, and Malik tossed in a first aid kit heavy enough to impress a wilderness guide. Everyone liked the balance of skills and the promise of a lake nearby. Everyone wanted quiet. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it there? They met in Warren just before sunrise on Friday, parking under a faded light outside a diner where the coffee smelled like burnt sugar. The temperature felt crisp, cold enough to fog breath, warm enough to go without gloves. They ate in a booth that rattled when trucks rolled past. The waitress kept calling the group early birds, and the nickname stuck through the morning like a charm. At 7, the town was behind them, the radio lost signal, and the forest swallowed the road. Pines rose in tight ranks as the asphalt dwindled into dirt and the sky thinned into pale silver between branches. They drove the last hour with windows cracked for the pine smell and the sound of gravel under the tires. At 9:40, they turned off onto a narrow logging spur, followed a faded arrow marker, and bumped through standing puddles until a small clearing opened before them. The creek curved around the site like a black ribbon. A mossy boulder stood at the far edge, and birch trees leaned together as if always whispering. The place felt private and older than the dirt road. It felt like a room that had not been used for a long time and yet kept neat. They stepped out, and every sound seemed louder than it should have been. Boots scraping, a car door shutting, the zip of canvas. The morning went smoothly, the tents went up facing the water, the lines were tight, the flies clipped down. Priya found a flat place for the cooler. June assembled the stove and made eggs that tasted like smoke and butter. Malik stacked firewood and showed everyone a trick for dry shavings. Nolan strung a blue cord between 2 trees and hung a lantern for later. The sun climbed, a gentle, warm circle above branches. The creek moved without talking. It was the kind of peace people pay for in a city. That early to midday stretch tasted like a promise kept. Around 2, a lone pickup rolled past on the logging road and paused at the clearing entrance. The driver kept the engine idling while he looked at the group. He wore a cap, tugged low, and his profile was angular and sun-emptied. He lifted 2 fingers from the wheel in a small salute, then drove on. The moment was ordinary enough, yet the engine note lingered in the trees long after the truck was gone. Priya laughed and said the man probably knew a better spot. Nolan said all the best spots were secret. Brooke checked the map again and traced a line from the creek to the lakeshore about a quarter-mile north. She wanted to stretch her legs before dinner, and everyone agreed the light would be perfect by 4. They started that walk at 3:52. Each with a bottle of water, the trail a faint seam in leaves and needles. The forest smelled darker there, less like pine and more like a cellar. They found the lake in a shallow bowl, the surface still and metallic, catching clouds like dull coins. A thin mist drifted and peeled. In the mud near the waterline, there were shapes, not boot tread. The marks looked long and narrow, with a little crescent at the front. June crouched and pointed. Maybe deer, maybe not. The spacing felt wrong. The stride felt too careful. Priya said it looked like someone dragged a canoe. Brooke said it looked like someone crawled out, and then she laughed because that sounded like the opening line of a bad story told around a fire. Malik took a photo and tucked the worry away, the way people tuck in a shirt they plan to change later. They got back at 5:10. The clearing had changed only by feel. The light had a lower copper tilt, and the shadows had pulled together in the corners of the trees as if the woods were exhaling. They built the fire, and there was a calm, serious joy in the way flame threads rose and caught. Dinner was simple: a skillet of peppers and sausage, a pot of beans, a second pot for water. At 6:30, the fire crackled white and orange. At 7, the birds went softer. At 7:38, the cold steepened, and they put on hats. By 8, the stars switched on in sudden scattered clusters. Everything felt earned. The talk turned to old classes, to cheap apartments, to late-night walks on sidewalks far from this place. Someone joked that if a forest wanted to scare city kids, it would only need to wait until the fire burned low. Everyone laughed, and the laughter sounded warm and full, and the woods held it like a cup. At 9:50, the first odd sound rolled across the water. A single hard splash, not a fish flick, not a rock drop. A heavy body entering with weight. It came from the north side, from the shallow bowl where they had stood in the afternoon. No one moved at first. The fire hissed. Then a second splash, closer. Malik stood and lifted his headlamp. The beam found mist, nothing else. A third splash, farther to the left now, like something changed lanes. Nolan joked that it was a beaver and that beavers worked night shifts. Brooke said beavers do not move like that. Jun said the echo might be odd over still water. Priya said they should save the last of the dry wood because the damp sticks would smoke. At 10:12, a soft whistling drifted through the trees beyond the road. Not a song, not wind and grass. Just 3 notes, rising and falling in a way that felt too deliberate to be shaped by air. It did not sound near or far. It sounded like the woods were carrying it on a shoulder and setting it down among them. The fire snapped, and the 5 looked at each other. No one smiled this time. Nolan said it was probably a hunter walking out late. Malik said night hiking could be dangerous and that nobody whistles at night in a place like this. June sat closer to the fire and wrapped his hands around his knees. Priya tossed a new stick to the flames and said they should call it a night as soon as the water boiled. Brooke checked her watch and said 10:20 is a normal time to get into sleeping bags. The plan felt good because it was a plan. They bedded down at 10:49. The fire was a red bowl. The lantern swung a little in a draft and made the trees look like they moved without moving. The zip of tent doors felt too loud. Nolan and Brooke in one tent. Priya alone in the small green dome she always used. June and Malik sharing a bigger one. The night poured over everything at once, thick and cool. At 11:30, the forest settled into that heavy quiet that makes even a breath sound like a stone thrown into a lake. At 12:07, Nolan woke because the hair on his arms lifted. He heard footfalls not on the road and not on the trail, but on the soft edge of the clearing. Slow, measured, steady, like someone circling to count tents. He held his breath and felt his chest sting. Brooke lay still. The steps past his door, faded, returned on the other side. He whispered that it was probably a deer. He stopped speaking because a pale oval moved across the tent wall, as if a face passed inches away. There was no outline of a nose, there were no eyes, just a smooth stain of lighter dark sliding by. He pressed his teeth together and did not move again. At 12:40, Malik heard it too. The steps were careful and almost patient. They stopped, then a soft dragging sound, then steps again. He touched June on the shoulder, and June nodded without opening his eyes. At 1:03, the whistling returned. The same 3 notes, now shaped like a call and answer. One set from the road, one from the creek, one from the black line of trees beyond the fire ring. Priya sat up in her tent and placed her palms on the floor like she could feel the vibration. She whispered her own name as if to hold herself inside it. The notes fell quiet. Her heart did not. At 1:30, a cry lilted across the clearing, a voice that sounded soaked, thin, and cold. It asked for help without forming a real request. It carried the shape of a plea without words. It sounded like a person, and also like a tape someone had warped. Nolan unzipped an inch of the tent and looked out. Nothing but mist and a darker dark, where the creek pooled. Malik unzipped as well, and his headlamp clipped the edge of a birch. The bark looked wet like a shed skin. No eyes glowed. No bodies fled. The cry came again. From the road this time, then from the lake, then from behind his tent. The distance felt wrong each time, like it measured something that was not space. At 2, they gathered by the ember bowl of the fire and fed it just enough to make light. No one said much, breath plumed white, the lantern hummed, the whistling settled into the low trees and paced them. Brooke gripped the handle of the camp hatchet without swinging it. Priya held a long flashlight with both hands like it could double as a baton. June stood with one boot half unlaced. Malik took a deep breath and called out that they did not want trouble. The syllables fell down right where he stood, like they had weight. Nothing answered. The water shifted. The mist leaned across the ground like a fog tide. By 3, the sound slowed, as if whatever moved had lost interest. The friends returned to their tents with the brittle pride of people who had endured something and could now insist it was nothing. Sleep came in frightened scraps when the first bleached version of sunrise slid under the treetops at 5:56. The relief tasted like clean water. They made coffee the way survivors make coffee, hands shaking, laughter a notch too loud. Daylight pushed the night backward into the tree line. It felt like being forgiven. Then they found the prints. By 7:10, the light was strong enough to peel mist off the lake, and there in the gray sand lay a sequence of marks that did not fit anything they knew. Long impressions, narrow at the front, widening mid-length, with faint lines that curved like ridges. They ran from the water to the tree line and back again. The stride was long. The path was an arc that circled the clearing twice. At one point, the marks crossed themselves in a way that suggested something had paused, crouched, and then stood. Malik measured one with his hand and said the length ran from thumb to elbow. June squinted and said it looked like something with webbed hands had walked on its fingers. Brooke said that was not how animals move. Priya said this was a bad idea made real and that they needed to leave. The vote came fast. Pack, drive out, breakfast on the road. They started at 7:31, trying to move calmly while moving fast. The tents came down in practice motions, yet the air felt wrong, as if the clearing were holding its breath. Malik reached for the lantern rope, and a wind that did not touch any leaves pushed across his neck. Nolan turned toward the creek and saw circles of ripples building where nothing had broken the surface. Brooke cinched the last strap on her pack and whispered that she could feel pressure in her ears. Priya tried her car first. The engine turned once and stopped. She tried again. Nothing but a heavy click. Jun tried his. Same click. Malik tried his. Dead. At 8:19, the whistling began again. Softer now, farther away, like the woods were practicing. Then the notes changed, lowering as if someone were walking toward a deeper room. Nolan grabbed the hatchet. Malik took the heavy flashlight. They agreed to walk the road south until they found a ridge with a phone signal. Brooke and Priya would stay with the gear and try to coax power from the portable battery. June would check the fuses. They drew a line of logic, like chalk, bright and hopeful. The south road ran along the creek and then cut up. After 10 minutes, the trees closed in and the air cooled by several degrees. At 8:49, they found the first of the old timber signs nailed to a trunk. The letters were gouged and faded. The words said no overnight use. The one below said day use only. The one below that said water level unstable. It felt like a warning whispered after the door already shut. Nolan said they did not stay by the lake, and Malik said the creek connects to the lake anyway, and that water does not respect little sign. The whistling drifted again, but now it came from ahead and behind at the same time. Nolan slowed. Malik said they should mark the trail. He tied a red bandana to a low branch and felt stupid doing it, then felt worse for not doing it sooner. At 9:12, the smell changed. Less pine, more iron. They crested a rise and saw the old iron bridge that crossed the creek where the water narrowed. The deck was banged up and patched with plywood. On the near side, something had scratched the railing with the head of a nail. Rows of tall, thin marks, grouped in threes, dragging down to the ground like someone had been bored and patient at the same time. They walked past slowly. The bridge hummed under their weight. The creek moved under them in black sliding planes. Aliquot waves licked the stones. Mid-span, Nolan looked down and saw his own face bent by the water, and then beside it, another pale oval drifting up from deeper than a person could stand. He stepped back too fast, his heel clanged against the rail, and the sound went into the trees like a thrown coin. They made it to the ridge at 9:48 and found a bar of service on Malik's phone. He dialed the ranger station number Brooke had written on a torn map corner. It rang twice and cut out. He tried again. A voicemail webbed across the line, the words too slow. He asked for help at Kinzua Creek and said they could not get their vehicles to start. He gave the coordinates the way his hand would give away secrets when it shook. Then he held the phone in the air as if that could push the message forward. He hit send. The screen blinked. The bar of service disappeared like a boy learning a magic trick. After that, the phone refused to light. They returned at 10:30, moving faster now. The clearing looked exactly the same and entirely different. The gear lay where they left it, but the cooler lid was open, though the latch was engaged. A line of wet silt lay across the ground in a curve like a resting body had left its outline. Brooke and Priya stood by the dead cars with their hands pressed flat against the hoods as if listening. June knelt by a battery with the case open and a set of fuses fanned on the ground like cards. Priya said the walk had taken too long. Brooke said a log had knocked against the stones and made them both jump. Her voice had that higher edge people carry when they have crossed from fear into the bright space where fear feels useful. Malik said the call might have gone through. The words felt weak while still true. They tried to eat at 11 because eating proves a day is normal. The food tasted like something stored in a basement that does not want to be a home. The forest had that noon silence that falls heavy on thin places. At 1, the sky turned white and then deeper gray. Nolan sharpened the hatchet with small strokes because motion felt better than stillness. Priya laid out the map and traced a route that would cut across to an old service road by late afternoon. Brooke argued they should not split again. June whispered that he could hear water under the ground as if the creek was also above them. Malik said everyone would stay together if they walked, and the rule felt like a rope. At 2, the light began to behave like late day. It was not late day. It only looked like it. Clouds slid in without wind. The whistling did not come back. The relief made them feel bold in the wrong way. They decided to move. Backpacks on, lantern stuffed into the top of a bag, a single car key in each pocket because superstition sometimes gets promoted to policy. They stepped onto the trail at 2:20 and felt that strange tilt of land found in old saloons and strange hallways. The forest was not flat. The forest was not honest either. They did not make it to the service road. At 3, the trail vanished without warning in a stand of young pines. The needle floor pressed smooth like a swept church. They spread out to find the worn line again, calling names in low voices. Malik called for Priya and heard his voice return from the right, though he had spoken to the left. Nolan called for Brooke and heard the name slide away as if the trees were carrying it. June said he saw the blue flash of the lantern cord. He did not. He saw a strip of something bright hanging from a lower branch, and when he reached it, he found his own red bandana tied tight, smelling faintly of his pocket and something muddy. They had looped back without a corner in the path. At 3:30, they were in the clearing again, though. None of them had turned their bodies. It was as if the clearing had stepped forward to greet them. The fire ring sat black and clean. The cars hunched. The lake beyond the trees lifted mist that now lay across the ground in thin belts. Brooke started to cry and did not apologize. Malik pressed his palms to his eyes and counted to 10. Nolan said they would make a bigger fire before dark, and the work would keep their minds steady. Priya sat on her pack and listened for the whistling. The silence was worse. They built the tallest legal fire and then built it taller. At 5:10, flames jumped high enough to paint the birch trunks gold. At 5:40, something moved in that painted world at the edge of the light. Not a person, not a deer. Tall and thin as a drawn line, it shifted between 2 trees and seemed to bend when it did not bend. The shape stopped, Then a second shape crossed behind it in the other direction. Nolan went still in a way that makes animals forget there is meat in you. June whispered that if they made noise, it might announce them. Brooke whispered that silence had already done that job. At 6, the crying came back. That same soaked and thin sound. It asked for help from the road, then from the creek, then from beside the lantern rope. They stood together because loneliness would have ended them. The fire felt like a fragile wall. The voices drew close, then stopped, as if testing their own boundaries. Malik lifted the heavy flashlight and said with complete calm that they would hold this line until dawn. He said it loudly enough to convince his own nerves that they could obey him. At 7, the mist thickened. It rose from the creek and slid along the ground at knee height, seeping into the clearing rather than blowing in. It smelled like coins and old wood. The firelight turned it into a living thing. The shapes at the edge of the trees stepped nearer, then paused, then nearer again. Nolan saw one limb bend the wrong way like a hinge on the outside of a door. Priya pressed her back against Malik and kept the beam of her light at waist level because the space above the waist felt like an invitation. June put another log on the fire and said the fuel would run out by 11 if they fed it at this rate. Brooke said 11 was a number that felt very far away and that they would find a way to stretch the pile like poor people stretch soup. At 8:19, the first voice behind them spoke. It said Nolan in a perfect copy of Brooke's cadence, but Brooke was standing in front of him holding the hatchet. He kept his face still. It said Malik in a ribbon of Priya's voice, but Priya did not open her mouth. It said June with the soft laugh Malik used on lucky days. The edge of the clearing seemed to press in with each name, as if a roll call might replace a boundary. The fire popped and threw an ember that died before it landed. The dark became a muscle. Then the water erupted. A heavy strike on the lake surface, then another, like bodies leaping and falling and leaping again. The sound hammered at the air and drove birds from trees they had not seen. The friends did not turn. They held the circle like a small city. The splashing stopped, as if it had only wanted to prove that it could become louder whenever it liked. At 9, the lantern burned steady. The fire had slumped and revived and slumped again. The gear near the cars had taken on a glitter of damp. On the ground by the cooler lay a track like the ones at the lake, except deeper, except smeared with silt, pushed up in a thin fringe like gills. Nolan knew that if he followed that mark with his eyes, it would lead out of the clearing toward the creek, and he knew that if he looked up, he would see something looking back from that place. So he did not look up. He looked at the base of the birch instead and counted the curls in the bark. 1, 2, 3. He discovered that counting does not work on fear when the numbers have nothing to hold. At 10:11, the whistling bloomed again, and it was inside the clearing now. It came from the line where their boots stood. It came from the space under the folding table. It came from the thin place between two logs. Each time it rose, their minds tried to place a mouth under it and failed. Priya began to pray in a way that had no words. Malik placed the flashlight on the ground and rested his hand on the top as if it were a sleeping dog. June whispered that the battery was getting warm, and that meant nothing, he understood. Brooke steadied the hatchet against her leg and told the space in front of her that it was not welcome. Her voice did not shake. That mattered. At 11, the woodpile turned small. The sky above the mist had that black depth that looks like it can fold down and make a new ceiling over everything. The shapes at the edge of the clearing had grown more confident. They leaned against the light and let it reveal them wrong, limbs too long, heads without the geometry of a face. Sometimes a flat white oval hung where the idea of a face should go. The oval turned and turned like a coin on a table. Occasionally, a mouth appeared and stretched in a grin that did not reach any eyes, and then slid away as if the skin did not know how to hold it. At 11:42, something stepped into the clearing. Not far, just one step over the line where the mist met the firelight. It bent a little like a person considering how they might walk in an unfamiliar room. It lifted an arm that had an extra hinge. It held a shape at the end of that arm. It was a glove, Priya's glove, the one she had dropped near the cooler at noon. The thing let the glove fall. It listened to it fall. Then it retreated in one precise movement, as if the glove had been enough to say a word. Midnight arrived without being announced. The night air had a physical weight. Each of them had made a small private promise in their head, and none of those promises sounded sane. Then a new sound climbed out of the trees. Footsteps, but not on the ground. Footsteps on wood. A slow, heavy rhythm, like someone climbing a set of stairs that did not exist. The sound moved down, and then down again, and then down once more. It came to rest at a place where there was no place. The whistling followed, 3 notes, lower than before, shaped like a door opening. The wind huffed once and died. Somewhere in the dark, in water they could not see, a bubble rose and burst with a small wet pop like a tiny hand breaking the surface. Nolan said they had to break the pattern. His voice sounded older. He said the clearing was running them in circles. He walked to the lantern rope and pulled it down. He untied the lantern and hooked it to the belt of his jacket. He told the others they would walk not by the road, not by the trail, but straight line toward the ridge, past the iron bridge, no turns, no looking back, fire in view until it could not be kept in view. He was gambling on motion. He was betting his body on a compass no one could hold. They agreed because sometimes agreeing is survival. They left at 12:14, the lantern a floating sun on his hip, the fire throwing long petal shadows behind them. The mist slid over their boots like little waves. The whistling swelled with the first 10 steps and then thinned, as if it did not like them moving together. The trees arranged themselves into lanes. The trunks looked like pillars in an old building. For 20 minutes, the plan worked. The clearing did not return. The ridgeline grew as a blacker dark lifting above the usual dark. The creak noise sharpened and became directional. The group saw the sheen of the iron bridge rails through the trees. Then the lantern dimmed. Not a slow loss, a single stutter, and then a new weak yellow. Nolan jostled it with his elbow. The light flared and then thinned again. Malik said they should stop to fix it. Nolan said no. Brooke said keep going because stopping had become a kind of consent. Priya began counting steps again and made it to 213. June said the air by the bridge tasted metallic. They stepped onto the deck and the wood spoke in deep chords. The creek rushed and the sound was a relief. Water that moved with purpose felt honest. Halfway across, the light failed completely. They stood in a dark so full it felt granular. The whistling started up from below the bridge, low, patient, rising with the water spray. The 3 notes repeated until repetition became a shape. Jun lifted his phone, and the screen glowed faintly from stored charge. In that smeared blue rectangle, they saw the outline of something climbing the far railing. Long, narrow, the hands finding grip where there was no grip. It moved with a certain care that said it had learned to move this way. It reached the top and unfolded. Its head turned toward the group, not with curiosity, but with the slow attention a creature uses when its hunger is old and ritual. It held something at the end of one arm, a strip of cloth, red. Jun's bandana. They ran. They did not argue first. They did not urge each other. They moved because all the stories in their muscles told them to move. The deck thudded, the whistling climbed and became very loud. The shape did not chase with speed. It only took steps that were too long and too smooth. Nolan felt breath at the back of his neck, though nothing touched him. Malik kept his hand on Priya's shoulder to keep them together. Brooke held the hatchet low, like a weight that could keep her on the path. Jun kept the phone lit and cried without sound. They made it to the other side and into the trees. The phone light flickered. The lantern gave one last weak glow like a wounded star and then died. The forest closed in again with that polite cruelty that looks like grace. The whistling fell behind, returned ahead, fell behind again, as if the woods breathed it. The group slowed because their bodies forced it. At 12:58, they stepped into a space that their brains recognized a split second before their eyes. The clearing. The cars. The fire collapsed into a black ring, the mist heavy as a blanket. They had run the shape the woods wanted. What came after belongs to the night more than to any language. There was motion at the edge of vision like fish under ice. There were names spoken in voices that existed and did not. There was the creak of wet woods somewhere overhead. There was the first pale smear of dawn at 5:31 that lifted the mist like a stagehand pulling a scrim. And there was the final splashing at the lake, heavy and rude, like a door slamming on a house you never entered. When sunlight finally touched the tops of the birches, the clearing became a normal patch of ground. It wore the morning like a disguise. A fisherman found Nolan on a dirt spur at 7:20, walking without direction with the lantern still tied to his belt. His jacket was wet to the ribs, and his lip had a split the size of a seed. He said very little on the ride into town. He said the cars would not start. He said his friends were packing. He said the woods had too many steps in it. Later, when a deputy asked him what he meant by too many steps, and he stared at the floor and said that on the second night he had counted 6 sets of footfalls when there should have been 5. And then he had counted 7, and then he had realized he could not tell whether any belonged to them anymore. He did not add more. When the search party reached the clearing that afternoon, the site looked tidy. The tents had been neatly struck, the fire ring was clean and cold. On the sand by the lake lay a set of prints that ran from water to trees and then back again. Long, narrow. With the faint suggestion of webbing near the front, no boot tread overlapped them. A glove lay near the cooler and held the blade of the camp hatchet inside it, as if a child had dressed the tool. In a birch branch at the clearing edge hung a red bandana tied in a square knot that none of the friends knew how to tie. The deputy touched it with a pencil and let it hang. The cars both started with a single turn of the key. The battery cables were snug, the fuses sat where they belonged, the radios worked. The ranger who stood near the road and listened to the creak said that sometimes a strong thermal layer will play tricks on sound. He said it the way a man says a prayer when he has lost the words of the prayer and must make new ones. A volunteer tried to laugh. No one joined. As for Malik, for Priya, for Brooke, for Jun, no one found them that weekend. Not the next one either. The search widened and then grew perfunctory and then stopped. Nolan left the county and never returned. He does not like bridges now. He does not like the sound of 3 notes whistled in a kitchen or a parking lot. He does not like a phone signal that fades during the first part of a sentence and returns during the last. He does not like the smell of coins. When the subject of camping comes up, he says there are places where silence is not empty. He says some lakes keep their own time and that the clocks humans bring with them mean nothing there. Drivers on the logging road report harmless things. A mist that hugs the ground even on warm days. A splash heard when the lake lies flat. A thin voice that sounds like a friend calling from a little way off that stops as soon as anyone answers. People are good at ignoring. People will say it is the wind. People will say it is the highway far off. People will say it is a beaver. On some nights, near the end of the long quiet, when the sky has that dark that feels like the last page of a note, a soft whistling moves between the birches. 3 notes, then 3 again. The sound circles once as if counting. It waits. It circles again. It waits longer. It does this until the first bird speaks. The sound does not travel uphill. The sound stays low to the ground where the mist lies. The sound is not for the high things. A simple camping trip turned into pure horror. That is the line a person gives a stranger at a bar to avoid the real version. The real version is this. The woods can learn your names and give them back to you with a shape you do not want to hear. The water can remember when you were alone, even if your friends stand so close their sleeves touch yours. The night can walk around your camp with borrowed legs. And when morning arrives, it can leave just enough behind to make a human mind choose to explain instead of run. If you go, and you will, because some people always go, take fire that does not depend on batteries. Tie your rope where you can see it from the corner of your eye. Refuse to answer when a voice uses your own voice to call you. Listen closely at 12:07 because that hour loves first steps. If you hear 3 notes, do not whistle back. If you see prints that do not line up with anything you know, do not take a picture like a tourist. Keep your eyes on the bark. Count only what you can hold. And when the lake is still as metal and every tree has leaned together to watch, remember that there are nights when staying is a kind of consent. Remember that water has its own doors. Remember that some places are patient. Remember that the woods around Kinswood Creek have all the time in the world.